we're back. Somehow, we didn't get canceled last time, so we'll try harder this time.
This is Will U. Ryan, the fantasy football philosopher. Last week, I talked about startup drafts. You can find that episode and tons of additional content at FantasyNowPlus.com. Today, you get to learn how to filter wide receiver profiles so you can target the target hogs before your league mates.
I'm starting off today's episode with a mailbag. If you ever have questions you'd like to have discussed on the show, find me on Blue Sky at FFPhilosopher, or you can drop an email to ffphilosopher6@gmail.com. Our first question comes from Nate Beers on Blue Sky. He poses a question that many in the fantasy football community are likely wondering. Is the running back renaissance for real? Will running backs hold higher value in Dynasty moving forward as veterans play at a high level later in their careers? Or do we still stand by the theory that running back careers are shorter and should be valued less? It's a great question. I need to answer it in parts as I think some of my response is going to be a little bit conflicting without proper context. First, is the running back renaissance for real? No. We're just seeing the end of careers for some of these outlier players. Saquon has always been a generational prospect, and Henry has been a physical outlier, and it's been evident their entire career. There have been 21 players that hit 17 plus points per game within their first 3 years in the NFL since 2015. 16 of those running backs are still in the league. So I think we're just seeing the outliers produce like outliers. It shouldn't impact our overall valuation of the position in total, only our valuation of outlier prospects. Second, will running backs hold higher values in Dynasty moving forward as veterans play at higher levels later in their careers? Yes, but that doesn't mean that they should. Fantasy football is quite reactionary from season to season, so we will definitely see running backs selected earlier in 2025 drafts than we saw in 2024 drafts. For the best of the best, that's fine, but for the rest, you're passing at better options on wide receiver, tight end, and QB. Third, do we still stand by the theory that running back careers are shorter and should be valued less? Yes. The typical running back career is still shorter than the typical wide receiver, tight end, or quarterback career. You can ignore this concern once a player has proven to be an outlier, but until that happens, you should keep the assumption that running backs are shorter-term assets. The next question comes from the handle, Where Did We Go Wrong? Or at BlueSky13. They ask, I'm seeing Jonathan Taylor as a sell on Dynasty in a few places. Just acquired him in a deal along with CeeDee Lamb. What are your thoughts on Taylor? I think we need to look at JT's season in multiple parts. I'm going to break it down into 3, weeks 1 to 4, then weeks 8 to 13 after he was returning from his week 4 injury, and then finally the post-bye weeks from 15 to 18. For the first 2 portions of the season, he was rushing 19 times a game. For the last 4 games, that number jumped to 23.4. The yards per carry started off pretty good. First 4 games, 4.85 yards per carry. Coming back from the injury, down to 3.99, and then at the end of the season again, back up to 5.36. Then, you can see his explosion get impacted too. He starts off in the first 4 weeks, breaking 9.7% of his runs for 15 or more yards. In the middle parts of the season, as he recovers from injury, that dips all the way down to 3.5%. Just really no explosion. At the end of the season, it's back to a more normal 5.1%. From looking at this, it's pretty clear his explosion was sapped for weeks as he returned from injury. Post-bye, he was a different runner, and his coaching staff treated him as such, increasing his workload as he proved more effective. Right now, I've got him valued right around the 2025 4th or 5th pick. You're probably looking at Omarion Hampton or Travion Henderson right now based on mocks. If you compare those players, Taylor was just a significantly better prospect. Hampton and Henderson had speed scores of 111 and 114. Definitely solid, but Jonathan Taylor had a speed score of 121. In college, their missed tackles forced per attempt were .25 and .21 versus Jonathan Taylor's .24. No real difference there. The yards per carry after contact, Hampton at 4.08, Henderson at 3.84, Jonathan Taylor, best of the three, at 4.29. Now, people complain about Jonathan Taylor's receiving work, and yes, that's not his strength, but it's not as bad as you think. Hampton and Henderson were averaging 2 and 1.6 receptions per game in college. Jonathan Taylor was down at only 0.9 per game. However, the targets per route run for Hampton and Henderson are at 0.13 and 0.12. Jonathan Taylor was getting 26% targets per route run. His yards per route run was also better. Hampton and Henderson were at 1.09 and 1.12 yards per route run. Jonathan Taylor was up at a fairly effective 1.54. He's also more explosive. The breakaway percentages, 8.15 and 10.23 for Hampton and Henderson, compared to 10.42 for Taylor. And finally, I just think Taylor's a better workhorse. Through their college careers, Hampton and Henderson have averaged 19 and 14 touches per game. Jonathan Taylor averaged 23. Now, I can give Travion Henderson a little bit of a break for sharing his last season with Judkins. But still, 14 to 23 is a big gap to make up. Taylor owns his backfield and produces with minimal receiving work, which means that can't really be taken away. Are Hampton and Henderson going to own a backfield, or are they going to come into the league and be committee backs? There's risk baked in with these rookies. Now let's move on to the main event of the episode. We're going to dive in so you can get a feel for what a wide receiver profile is and why they can be so useful. First, I'll define a wide receiver profile as all of the information we have about a wide receiver prospect heading into their rookie season. This could be high school recruitment, college career, including stats, and any unfortunate curriculars that may make the news. The pre-draft process, which could be made up of the combine or their pro day. You want to take all of this information, and when you line up the profiles for wide receivers in the NFL, you start to see some similarities among many of the successful prospects. But why does that matter? Because you can use all of the prior data that we have measuring profiles of previous wide receiver prospects to figure out what benchmarks need to be met to predict success in the NFL. This also means you don't have to know ball. This isn't scouting and won't use film review, as that tends to end up with subjective results. The profile we are looking for has specific benchmarks that historically align with NFL and, more importantly, fantasy football success. I'm going to start with talking through the different metrics that I use when I'm looking at wide receiver prospects. The first, and probably one of the most important pieces, is draft capital. Essentially, where are these prospects selected in the NFL draft? You can do it by round, or you can do it by pick. I tend to work from a style of binning prospects, which is just basically making groups of prospects and putting them together. If you're trying to do a model that actually predicts a particular output number, trying to predict how much they're going to score, you probably want to be much more specific in terms of the actual pick number that they're taken at. It's also important to look at age. Players that are ready for the NFL at younger ages show that they're better athletes. It's also important to note where prospects went to school. High major prospects playing a potential national championship caliber schedule are going to be different than group of 5 players. There's another metric that I'm going to hope everybody can go out to and check later this year once we get information from the combine and pro days. That's called the relative athletic score. You can find this at ras.football. The relative athletic score takes all of the physical inputs from the combine, standardizes the output into a scale of 1 to 10 so that you can get a simple explanation of how athletic someone is. You can then compare these within position groups to see who's more explosive from a wide receiver perspective. The higher the number, the more athletic they are. The lower the number, the less athletic, and they're going to have harder time separating against NFL cornerbacks. Talking about age a little bit ago, we also want to make sure we think about how much experience they have. But how many seasons have they been in a college program? Because that's really how much time they've had to develop. You also want to know, when do they break out? And I'll pause there because it's important to define breaking out. I define breaking out as hitting 20% on a dominator rating. Dominator rating is a common tool used to evaluate wide receiver prospects. It's essentially the weighted portion of that receiver's production for his team. I use a pretty standard weighting of 80% for yardage and 20% for touchdowns. So I take 80% of the wide receiver's yards compared to the total team yards and add 20% of that wide receiver's touchdowns compared to the team's receiving touchdowns. You add those together and you get a percentage output that's the dominator. To break out, we're looking for people to exceed 20% or be more than 1/5 of their team's receiving production. We want to know when these players are breaking out. Like I was talking about earlier, older prospects obviously have had more of a chance to mature. So if somebody's breaking out their first year out of high school, that's a lot more impressive than someone breaking out in their 5th or now 6th thanks to the COVID years. It's also important to understand, is there a breakout gap? I define this to be when someone does break out, they hit 20% for the first time. Do they go back to school for more than 1 year? Because sometimes players break out just barely, but they know they can do better. And I'm not going to hold it against them to come back and prove that they can just absolutely dominate the next year. So if you break out in year 3 and come back for year 4 in college, I'm not going to penalize you for that. But if you break out your first year, become draft eligible after 3 years, and decide you're still going to stay in college another year or two, there better be a pretty dang good reason. Otherwise, I tend to think they just know that they aren't going to be able to dominate the way that they can in college once they get to the NFL. And history shows those are the prospects that tend to miss. You're also going to want to look at all of the combine outputs. This is going to be measurements, height, weight, hand size. You get different events to measure physicality. You got the 40-yard dash for speed, the 20-yard shuttle, and the 3-cone for agility, vertical jump and broad jump, and bench press. Now, I take weight and 40 time and combine them into the speed score. This allows us to standardize for different player sizes, because it's much easier to be very, very fast when you're lighter. When you're heavier with a lot of muscle, if you're nearly as fast as someone smaller, it's a lot more impressive and you are a lot harder to tackle. So if you want to calculate speed score, all you have to do is take 200 times their weight in pounds and divide that number by their 40 time in seconds to the 4th power. So that's 200 times their weight divided by their 40 time times their 40 time times their 40 time times their 40 time. That number comes out, and it should be somewhere in the range of 100. You'll see it range anywhere down from 80 sometimes all the way up above 120. So really what we're looking for there is something kind of above the 108, 110 mark is usually considered to be very good. Now, I know that's a lot of information and just listing different pieces of data that I collect about wide receivers. So what does that actually mean? How does it help us? Well, I'm going to give you a sneak peek into my article posted on FantasyNowPlus.com, How to Whittle Down Wide Receivers. I came up with a wide receiver 3 profile. So we're looking at players who score approximately 11 fantasy points per game within the first 3 years in the league. That's a pretty standard number. It's not going to kill you in fantasy, but it's not elite. In the 10 drafts from 2013 to 2022, in which the players now have had 3 years in the league to prove that they can score 11 fantasy points per game, wide receivers drafted only hit that mark 27% of the time. But you can drastically improve the odds of finding a player with wide receiver scoring or better, and you really only need to apply 3 of the criteria that I talked about. First, was the player drafted in the first 3 rounds? We mentioned draft capital, and it matters. The NFL scouts know what they're looking for. The NFL is a business with billions across the league on the line. The best people at evaluation work in the NFL, and as much as armchair and internet scouts like to tell them they're wrong, they actually do a pretty good job in the long run. The next piece of information is whether or not the player broke out within their first 2 years following high school. So, did they come in as a true freshman and break out, or did they break out in their second year so that they're allowed to redshirt if they want, but then the second year out of high school, they need to hit that 20% mark on the Dominator rating. The last piece looks at the competition they faced. Right now, there's been a whole heap of conference realignment the last few years. It makes this discussion a little bit more difficult, but the takeaway actually becomes more clear with the new conferences. If you take the current alignment, now, I know the Pac-12 has been decimated and teams have moved out of the Big 12 into some other conferences, while the Big 12 has scooped up some of the Group of 5 schools. Did the player come from either the Big 10, the SEC, or the ACC conference? If you look only at these criteria, so remember, first 3 round, breaking out in the first 2 years, and coming out of a school from the Big 10, SEC, or ACC, that 27% hit rate of all drafted wide receivers jumps all the way up to 73%. Now, we don't just want wide receiver 3 production. So I do go on to explain a profile that has a very strong hit rate for wide receiver 1 numbers. I know this is a podcast, so you are stuck listening to me, but you're probably also not here for story time. So I'm not just going to read the article to you. If you want to find out the wide receiver 1 profile, please feel free to go out and read the article. It's available for free out on FantasyNowPlus.com. Instead, I'll talk through some of the metrics that I use to whittle down the population and give you some examples of why it's effective. Remember, from the article, we're looking at 10 years of wide receivers that got drafted into the NFL. It's from 2013 all the way to 2022, making sure that everybody has at least 3 years to prove whether they're good enough to hit wide receiver 1 numbers. So I said with the previous profile for wide receiver 3 production that you can kind of look at just the first few rounds. So let's look at the overall hit population first. So of 314 wide receivers, 314 got drafted over those 10 years. 8 were able to hit wide receiver 1 production within their first 3 years. That's Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, Deebo Samuel, Tyreek Hill, Odell Beckham, DeAndre Hopkins, and Keenan Allen. Now, if we look at where those players were selected in the draft, half of them were selected in the first round. Then 1 each in rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you can see, being selected earlier in the draft gives you a better chance at actually being a good player. The NFL scouts do actually know what they're doing sometimes. Let's look at hit rates for restricting down to different levels. If we take out any 6th or 7th round picks, now we only have a population of 217 where we're getting our 8 hits. We know Tyreek Hill is the only 5th rounder. If we take out 5th round picks, we now have 7 hits out of 175 drafted wide receivers from rounds 1 through 4. If we take out round 4, we still know that we've got 5 hits, but we're down to a total population of 132. It just gets progressively better and better every time. The first 2 rounds offer 5 out of 92, and round 1 wide receivers are 4 out of 42. So that's still under 10%, which is why you want to build an entire profile looking at multiple metrics. You also might have been wondering earlier why I chose the 3 conferences in particular to look for. If you remember, it's the Big Ten, the SEC, and the ACC. Now, if we look at hits outside of those conferences, remember, we're looking for wide receiver 1 production. That's 20 points within the first 3 years. If we take out those 3 conferences, we're left with 128 players drafted from other conferences. Out of those 128 players, Tyreek Hill is the only one to hit wide receiver 1 scoring within the first 3 years. That's why I take only those conferences. And yes, again, I understand schools have been realigning conferences for the last few years. Just because they're in the Big Ten, the SEC, or the ACC now, doesn't mean that some of these historical prospects played against those conferences. I understand that argument, but I also think there's something to be said for having better programs get scooped up by better conferences. Maybe it was the programs that were producing more NFL talent that moved from the Pac-12 and the Big 12 into the Big Ten, the SEC, and the ACC. And that's why we're able to restrict it down to just 3 conferences. Now, I mentioned experience and how we want to see how long players have been out of high school, because it could end up that we've got grown men playing against boys who just turned 18. It's a lot easier to dominate in that situation. If we look at these players who hit wide receiver 1 numbers within the first 3 years, 6 of the 8 left college after 3 years. Tyreek Hill was there for 4 after moving around 3 different schools, and he's kind of an outlier prospect anyway because he was so fast that he got a lot of touches at running back and receiver, so his breakout is a little bit funky. Deebo Samuel was the only one who stayed in school for 5 years, and that's because he suffered a major injury when he would have been ready to go for the NFL. So instead, he came back to prove that he was fully recovered. Talking about dominator rating now, there is a huge variance for these drafted wide receivers. Okay, we look at the whole population of drafted wide receivers, and you will see dominator ratings reached. Some players didn't even break out. I mean, we're talking down at 15% of their team's production, but still getting drafted. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are prospects who are hitting over 50% on the dominator rating. Over 50% of their teams receiving production. So it's important to look through there and decide what you want to set your threshold at in order to make sure that you're capturing good players and kind of weeding out the players that just don't have what it takes to succeed at the NFL level. Moving on, I really hate to discriminate, but there are certain size limitations in the NFL that the trends are just too strong to ignore. I know there have been smaller, quicker wide receivers coming in and succeeding lately, but that doesn't mean that the vast majority of those smaller players fail. So really take some time to understand the size of the players that you're interested in. How tall are they? What's their catch radius going to be? How big are they? Are they stick thin and potentially going to break the first time a safety hits them at full speed? Or are they built like a tank and they're going to be hard to bring down anyway? It all matters in context of how these players play, so it's important to take note and decide where you want to set your thresholds for height and weight. At the Combine, my favorite event to track is honestly the broad jump. The broad jump most correlates with explosiveness that you're going to find when actually playing in the NFL. So I think it's really an underrated tool to use to identify who the best athletes are. If we take a look at our population according to broad jump, we get down to 280 players that recorded a broad jump, either at the Combine or at the Pro Day that I was able to find. Now, of those 280, 74 of them were able to hit wide receiver 3 production. Okay, so that's about 25%, 1 in 4. Now, if we look for people who have demonstrated a broad jump below, let's say, 117, because I want to look for a mark of about 120, which is 10 feet. So if we say less than 117 and does not equal, I use a dummy value of 0 if they don't test. So looking for a value less than 17. Now we're down to 49 players who had a broad jump below 17. Of those players, only 10 hit wide receiver 3 production. So that's worse than the 1 in 4, which means by taking them out, you're making your selection better if you're looking for players who demonstrate broad jumps above 117 or who don't test. And the reason I bring up not testing is because a lot of times you're going to end up seeing the top prospects skip testing. They know they're going to be picked in the first round. They don't need to go all out in the 40-yard dash or the vertical jump or the broad jump and risk pulling a muscle and hurting their draft stock. So you need to decide how you want to handle that. There will be some situations where you want to look for someone who's able to demonstrate a minimum level of production, or you could get into a situation where you want to eliminate players who don't meet a certain threshold. It's important to think about which way you want to go because it impacts how you have to set your other selections. So to wrap up and show you how this all fits together, I'm going to use a profile that's based on our wide receiver 1s. But instead of playing around, I'm just going to look at minimums and set standards that all players need to match to stay in the population. Now, as I go through, I am going to end up weeding out 4 of our 8 hits because they are just so outliers on certain metrics that it doesn't make sense to keep them in. So if we look at some of these metrics, we end up with only round 1 or 2, only age 23 or less, only from the big SEC or ACC. We want a relative athletic score above 5. Not very impressive, but there are players that come in below that. You want 3 to 4 years in college. Need to be breaking out within the first 2 years. Can't have a breakout gap. Need to have a dominator rating of at least 30% in one of their years in college. Need to be at least 5'11". Need to be at least 198 pounds. Need to hit a speed score of at least 98 or not test. Need to hit a shuttle time of less than 4.5 seconds or not be able to test. A 3-cone drill under 7 seconds or not be able to test. A vertical of at least 36 inches or again, not testing. And finally, a broad jump of 115 or more or missing out on testing. If we take all of that, just kind of grabbing the minimum that we find from our hit players, we end up with a population of only 8 players matching the criteria, 4 of which are our hits. That gets us all the way up to 50%, which is pretty good. But I promise you, if you take the time to dig into the data and play around with these thresholds, you're going to find criteria that's going to get your hit rate very, very high without limiting the population all that much. Okay, once we get down to 8 prospects over the last 10 years, you're averaging less than 1 prospect per year. That's not really sustainable, so that's not what we want to do. But we do want to increase our hit rate as much as possible. It's a give and take, and you just have to play around with different categories to figure out what thresholds you need players to hit. With that, this is Will U. Ryan, the Fantasy Philosopher, for Fantasy Plus Now. Signing off, I'll see you next week. We're back. Somehow, we didn't get canceled last time. So, we'll try harder this time.